Hi, I'm Mitch, and welcome to the Restoration Road, where today's guest is Andy Foster. Andy has an amazing story of restoration and how God has used him to bring his restoration to others. His ministry is housed at the Cupbearer Cafe in Auburn, which has become a beacon of light to our community. It's a good place to buy a book, get a sandwich, have one of the best smoothies you'll ever have, and be in an atmosphere where you can experience the grace and restoration and wisdom of God. And he also has a ministry to those who have been released from prison and coming out of incarceration and needing training for a new career or job placement. And Andy has provided that opportunity to so many. So we invite you to listen to the amazing story of restoration of Andy Foster. Andy, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you, Mitch.
You have an amazing ministry in our community, and want everyone to hear your incredible story of restoration. You grew up here. You grew up in Spencerville, Indiana?
I did.
Went to Eastside High School?
Yep, a Blazer.
And then you went to Goshen College?
I did, yeah.
And what'd you major in?
I actually went there for a music major, had a music scholarship, sang all through elementary and high school. And when I got to college, I figured out that I really like music, but I didn't like theory. Mm-hmm. And so the idea of me teaching music kind of went by the wayside. And I took a public speaking course, and I fell in love. Fell in love with just communicating with people effectively and learning that. Mm-hmm. And so I changed my major to communications right at that time.
At that point in your life, what was your connection to God? Did you have a church background? Did you have Christians around you that had invested in you? What was that like for you?
No church background as far as church attendance. My folks, great people growing up, but maybe church a couple times, but nothing ever really stuck, nothing consistent. I was fortunate to have some people that started to invest in my life. I probably didn't recognize it as a Christian influence, but a teacher that was a Christian, Dwayne Beck, who just started to sow in my life and care about me. I had a friend who was a noticeable Christian, Mark Flood, and he would invite me to youth group, and I'd hear the youth pastor, and I'd hear the passion that my friend and the youth pastor had and about Christ, and I started hearing the gospel, but probably the most it ever translated for me was just stop doing the wrong things. Mm-hmm. Stop cussing, mm-hmm. Stop fooling around, mm-hmm. Stop doing stuff that's not right. Mm-hmm. It was more of just a list of don'ts. The idea of relationship just never really came into play. Mm.
So you graduate from Goshen College with a degree. Did you minor in education or get a second degree in education?
Yeah, I got this education certificate.
Okay.
So I don't know if it's a full-blown major, but you do a certain amount of hours. Mm-hmm. So I had a secondary education certificate to go along with communications. And in the state of Indiana, I took the test, and I actually had the ability to teach English, theater, speech, journalism, those kinds of things. And everybody thought that English would be the thing that would really get me a job, but believe it or not, in my first teaching job, I actually had the opportunity to teach speech and to do drama, and I did enjoy that.
And that was in South Bend?
It was, yeah.
And is that where you're Teacher of the Year?
Yeah.
Is that for the school system?
No, it's for students. Students got to choose the teachers that they maybe most admired or they most appreciated, and there's ceremonies to that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And it was a real honor, to be chosen for that by some of my students.
Now, you mentioned that at that time of teaching, you noticed that you started bringing down boundaries with students. Mm-hmm. How did that manifest itself?
I graduated college at 21 years old, turned 22 later that summer. It was pretty natural getting into the workforce and teaching education, and I was just pretty young. Again, I didn't have a lot of solid footing, and so the relationships that I had, even outside of the classroom, out of work, they were inappropriate. I didn't have appropriate relationships with women. I didn't have appropriate relationships with anybody. It was more about the events. It was more about partying. It was even in college, just start to experimenting with binge drinking and experimenting with drugs. And so when I went into the education field, I didn't have any kind of epiphany that now I'm a working adult. That cycle needs to change. That was my life. And so I clocked in, I had a job, and then I found myself clocking out at times. And all of a sudden it became easy to have kind of a double life. You know, it was one way in the classroom and then one way outside of that. And it did. It was easy to bring down boundaries. I didn't put any stakes in the ground. You know, I didn't talk to the administration. I just let the inappropriateness continue.
So how do you end up in Florida?
A couple years in teaching, I had a girlfriend at the time. She finished her master's degree, and so we communicated what would it be like to get out of Indiana, to transition. Heard some friends say that you know, Florida's always hiring teachers. You know, they've lots of schools, lots of stuff. You know, and so contacted a school about going down there and teaching, and had one interview, got a job. Same thing with my girlfriend. Again, she went to a teaching fair, got a job right away, and seemed like it was kind of a match made in heaven, you know, to an extent. So we packed up, decided to move in together, and moved to Florida. Had jobs, lived 10 minutes from the beach. It seemed like it was a pretty smart move.
Did you ever attend church in this time period at all?
I didn't. Okay. The few times that I did is that the gal that I was dating, she went to Mass, and so we would go. But to be honest with you, I mean, I know, looking back, I know that I wasn't engaged. You know, I probably was wanting to go, you know, because she wanted to go. But again, if we go back to this relational idea of God and the intimacy of God, not even on my grid.
Does that relationship come to an end with a girlfriend that you went to Florida?
Pretty much immediately.
Okay.
Pretty much immediately. Again, you know, it's so easy to think that I could change my circumstances and my life would change. Something internally would change, but it didn't. You know, I move in with a girl, I move to Florida, new job, and I say, okay, and this is my stake in the ground. You know, I'm going to do things right. I'm going to do things appropriately. And Mitch, that relationship was over within a couple months. And here I was, a bachelor in Florida, living minutes from the beach, thinking that I just had the opportunity to live the good life. And realistically, I just found myself in a sin lifestyle, spiraling out of control.
You said at age 26 you began your demise. Can you describe what that was?
I can. Again, boundaries was an incredible issue for me. Not only, you know, inappropriate with my students, but with other females, people that I taught with, people in the community. Just relationships were extremely inappropriate and with no boundaries. And again, I found myself so easily, you know, after trying to put some stake in the ground of change, you know, and moving to a new place, you know, I found myself wearing two faces. And you know, in the classroom, I tried to care about my students. I tried to do the best that I could to develop a program that would that they could excel in, and it's what people saw, and it's what I wore on my shoulder, and I loved the pats on the back, and I loved the exposure, and there's part of me that says, yeah, Andy really wanted to see my students be successful. I did, but I clocked out, and people didn't know about the Andy that they didn't see. They didn't know about the Andy who, you know, struggled still with the binge drinking. They didn't know the Andy who didn't like to spend a lot of nights alone. And whether that was with my female colleagues, with other people, I had a real problem with relationships and abusing those relationships and abusing my authority. And all the while, again, letting the boundaries being crossed between the student-teacher relationship.
And you end up in a relationship with a student.
I do.
And does that come to an end before another one starts? Or what transpired?
I mean, they were pretty synonymous. You know, again, I was wading into some water that was just treacherous, and it was my own doing. It's my own fault, and I've always wanted to be clear that I take full responsibility for that. And in that relationship, inappropriate. I was 26 with a senior student, and as I crossed the lines of inappropriateness, my response, it's like trying to dig yourself out of a hole, and you know that you can't. And so there's emotion, there's angst, you're on edge all the time. And in the midst of that, in the midst of inappropriateness and in unlawful relationship, I still wanted something to comfort that. I still wanted something to appease that. And so while that was going on, there were still inappropriate relationships, again, with colleagues, lawful but inappropriate. And it was in that same time frame that I allowed another unlawful, inappropriate relationship to come into the mix.
And you've said it, I just want to be clear, you see this as horrible, horrific.
I do.
The abuse of the role that you were in and the fiduciary responsibility that you had. But God still is going to intervene. How do you end up being confronted by the law?
In that year, in 2007, it was, I was at my wit's end. Not only struggling with these inappropriate relationships, my life was out of control, separated just even from my family. Again, no support structure around me, no real friends, and there came an evening, the gal that I had the relationship with actually graduated, and we got in a fight. And in that time, I shared with her that I didn't desire to be in a relationship anymore. And through that hurt that I caused, there was communication with her mom, and then there was a phone call made to the authorities. And I didn't know that. But the following day, there was a phone call. There's a phone call from the police that was interested in questioning. And I didn't answer that phone call. And I was just made aware that there was an investigation going on. And so, that's really where it came to a head. I didn't go to the police. I didn't turn myself in.
Just to be clear, the fight was an argument, not a physical fight.
That's correct.
Yeah, so you had an argument.
Yeah.
And it all comes around to this. And are you told at all that don't leave the state or anything like that? Or you just know there's an investigation and you're...
I just know there's an investigation.
Wow.
And the first thing that I really wanted to do is I wanted to see my parents. I wanted them to hear it from me. And so I took off on a road trip from Florida to Indiana, knowing in appearance, I was on the run. And I wanted to see my parents. I wanted to see them face to face. And when I got to see them, emotional, of course. And they just let me know how much they loved me and that they cared for me, and but also confronted me with the fact that I needed to turn myself in. And it's something that I did have a desire to do. It was not wanting to run. So I returned back to Florida. And while I was, before I turned myself in, we were working with a lawyer for a before trial hearing or a before arrest hearing to coordinate bond. And during that time, I was actually arrested. I was arrested by the U.S. Marshals that were looking for me. And that's really where I was just confronted with law enforcement. I think I was just in shock. They asked questions, but I just was quiet. I wouldn't have known better anyways. They maybe asked, why'd you do it? Why'd you run? And there wasn't much I could do besides just cry, have my head down. Just going through the things that, you really only see on movies, from the television cameras and, the microphones and, just being called a monster, and having to see my family go through that, and my mom and dad especially. It was difficult. So that's where it came to a head, and I was taken to the jail, the Palm Beach County Jail.
You're probably not prepared at all for the consequences that are going to unfold, but it also becomes a high-profile case, right?
When I was on the run, it was kind of an America's Most Wanted kind of thing, that we need to find him. Some of that was described as, for my best interest.
Mm-hmm.
I had a picture on my wall. It was a painting called Forever 27, and it had Janis Joplin and Kurt Cobain and some people that had committed suicide. Really no specific reason when I think about it in the past, but I was 27 when this was going on. And so there was this picture, and so there was just some awareness that said, we need to find Andy, because we're scared that he's going to commit suicide. And I'd be lying that while I was on the run, I've never really had a lot of those thoughts before, but that certainly was probably the first time that I ever thought, about taking my life.
Mm-hmm.
This is something that I didn't want to walk through. I didn't want to accept responsibility for this.
And I think you use your cell phone, and they ping it in a hotel. And
Correct.
That's where the 20 U.S. Marshals came.
Yeah.
So you're at least consciously, subconsciously contemplating suicide. I mean, you're at the bottom, and I think you don't even realize you're actually in confinement when they take you, right?
Yeah.
You're in the news every day, and what were you charged with? And what were you facing?
So I had 10 charges total. The first 5 were called custodial sexual battery. Those are first-degree felonies, 30 years each. And again, the custodial part was authority. I had an authoritative position. And then I had 2 second-degree felonies, unlawful sexual activity with a minor, and then I had 3 third-degree felonies. Added up in numbers, it was over 100 years.
Does the trial go fairly quickly?
So I remained in the county jail for 14 months, and high-profile case, stretched out over time, and by the advice of my lawyer, it just let some time, go by. This is not something that we had to rush or anything like that. I don't think that there was ever a thought of, let's take it to trial, let's win this thing. That was never really a thought. And I appreciate my lawyer. He said, let's take the time, let's the emotion diminish, and just let's have conversation over the next several months. And I had to learn to be patient. I had to learn to bide my time.
Now, are you approached by Milo, the chaplain, in the county jail, or is that in prison?
County jail.
Okay.
County jail, yeah. So, stuff, the first part, right? Of course, we talk is just heavy. And I'm thankful that there's something that God brings to this equation that is just, it's life and light. And I'm thankful for that. And so when I'm in that jail, I remember somebody says to me, "Hey, Teach," because that's what they called me. They said, "Why don't you go sign up to see a chaplain?" And now at the time, right, no real church background. I don't even know what a chaplain is.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the religious guy. It's the religious services guy. So I fill out a sheet. Next week or so, they let me out of my cell, and I'm in confinement, right? So anywhere I go, I'm chained, ankles, wrists. And they take me into this room, and I see this older gentleman, and he doesn't even say a word, and I begin to weep. And his name was Milo Torquila. And in that moment, I felt the weight and the implications of all of this. Not only the legality, but the separation that I had from life from God. And I just sat there and I wept. And Milo didn't say anything for a little while. He let me weep. I think he put his hand on my arm. And I finally picked up my head, and Milo said these words to me. He said, Andy, I want you to know that I've read the papers. I want you to know that I know everything that they're calling you. I know everything that you're facing. But let me tell you about a man named Jesus who is willing and wanting to redeem your life. And in a time, Mitch, that I would have never thought that was possible. Guilty. No explanation. Separated from God. Full of sin. Lifestyle of sin. Enemy of God. Totally depraved. Mm-hmm. And to hear that this man named Jesus is willing to redeem my life is a complete game changer. I don't know if I actually said the words, but I say this sometimes. Where do I sign? Because wherever that redemption comes from, I desperately want that in my life. I have to believe that there's still hope. And that was the day that I made a commitment to Jesus Christ that day. Wow. And accepted him as my Lord and my Savior and my Redeemer and the restorer of my life.
Praise the Lord.
Amen.
So how does your life unfold from that point through the trial?
I would love to paint an awesome picture that says it just, Jesus makes it all go away. Mm-hmm. But he doesn't. He was there with me every step of the way. And so in confinement, you're in a cell by yourself, and I was separated from the world. No visitations, no phone calls, no mail, no TV. Inside this cell, 24 hours a day. I had an opportunity to read. I had an opportunity to read the Bible. I had an opportunity to pray stuff that I had no idea what I was saying. Jesus, whatever you can do with my life, please do it. If you can restore or redeem my life, please do it. Please forgive me for my sin. Forgive me for the hurt that I've caused. I mean, I'm just praying. I'm talking to God, but I'm hearing from my lawyer, we got to continue to wait and let's trust. And so this time for me was a time to learn to trust God, trust in the midst of my circumstances. Mm-hmm. And so I had months and months and months. My lawyer maybe come see me a couple times a week. Milo came and saw me every single week.
Oh my goodness.
For 14 months, and he discipled me, and he pointed me towards Jesus, and he would teach me truth, and he would remind me that my life had such value in God's eyes. That my life is not what everybody else was gonna say, it is not what the papers was gonna say, that God had a plan for my life. Now, I could have never drawn the plan that he has done for my life, but Milo knew that I had a spot beside Jesus. Mm. And so I did my time. I became patient, and I prayed, God, whatever your outcome for my life is, I'm on board.
Wow. So what happens? What are you sentenced to?
So 14 months go by. I was offered 10 years in, and then 10 years of probation. You know, and to skip to the end, my lawyer came and saw me, and they offered me 5 years in prison and 10 years of probation afterwards. He said, pray about it. Prayed about it and let me know. And I took a couple days and I prayed about it. And I said, Lord, I'll tell you what, I am not excited about going to prison. But I want your will to be done in my life so bad. And so if this is it, then just give me a certain amount of peace. And that night I slept, which was a pretty big deal because I didn't sleep much for those 14 months. And I had a certain amount of peace. The next day I called my family and I called my lawyer and said, I'll accept the deal. Mm. And so I signed for a deal for the 5 in and the 10 out.
Where do you get a yellow legal pad and write inspiration with the T as a cross.
Yeah. So in that time after Milo led me to the Lord, the legal pad is kind of a common thing in the jail system, right? You can order a pad of paper and they'll bring it to you. So it's usually a legal yellow pad. And as I'm praying and I'm doodling, my hand's moving and I'm writing these block letters. And I write INSPIRA. I get to the T. I make the T a cross. ION. I throw a crown in there, little flickers. I'm not an artist. But you recognize, right? There's a cross in that. There's a lordship in that part. Inspiration. Not a word I used often or ever. I remember I prayed and I said, well, okay, God, I see this word. What is it? And I got nothing. I didn't get a word from the Lord. There was no epiphany. That little slip of paper went into my manila envelope, and I packed it up and I went to prison and took that with me.
So you go to prison. What penitentiary?
So I went through reception, and then I ended up at Quincy Annex.
Okay. Is that where you walk into a chapel?
That's at the reception center.
That's at the reception center.
Yeah.
So you walk into a chapel, and did they ask if someone wants to sing?
Yeah.
And what do you do?
Yeah, so I get to this reception center, right? And, the whole time I'm on the bus, and it doesn't take you long to tell. I'm 160 pounds, soaking wet, glasses, going to Florida Department of Corrections, scared, right? And in my mind, I'm thinking that if I can just huss and fuss and cuss like everybody else, if I can fit in. So I'm walking around the track and I see this open door. I may see chapel on it. I can't really remember. And I walk in, there's a couple volunteers, handful of guys. They're looking to have some kind of church service and they're looking for people to sing. And why I say I'll sing a little something, I have no idea. And I go up and I sing this Precious Lord, right? I mean, as much as I can. I'm crying all the way through it, And in the first words, it's this, precious Lord, take my hand, and I lose it.